The man in seat 27C stood up and cleared his throat like he was about to run a board meeting. I have a 6 o'clock meeting. People flew in from 3 states. This delay is completely unreasonable. 47 passengers. One of them hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't looked up. From row 17, a 63-year-old man with a tremor in his right hand turned slowly in his seat. He didn't stand, didn't raise his voice. Just turned. My son was killed in Iraq, Roy Tanner said. Flat quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a pressurized cabin completely. He made it home from the worst night of that war because the man in seat 12A stood between him and what was coming. He paused. My son came home for Christmas that year. 6 months later, he came home again. That time in a box. He looked at the man in the jacket. You can sit down and be quiet for 20 minutes. I've been doing it for 18 years. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. And the man in seat 12A, the one who'd caused all of this, without saying a single word, just kept looking out the window. Have you ever shared a space with someone, a seat, a waiting room, a plane, and had absolutely no idea what they had already been through? This is one of those stories. Except on this particular Thursday afternoon, at 35,000 feet over the Arizona desert, the truth came out. And nothing in that cabin was the same after that. The parking lot at Terminal 2, San Diego International Airport, was exactly the kind of place nobody thought about twice. Concrete, white lines painted at intervals, the smell of exhaust and jet fuel baking in October sun that had no interest in the fact that it was supposed to be cooling down by now. Cars came in and went out with the mechanical rhythm of a place whose entire purpose was transition. Nobody stayed. Nobody lingered. Nobody sat in their vehicle for 17 minutes staring through the windshield at a set of automatic glass doors. Except one truck, a dark green F-150 in spot 4C of the short-term structure. Engine off. Keys still in the ignition, because the man sitting in the driver's seat had not yet decided that the decision to turn off the engine was the same thing as the decision to go inside. He'd checked his watch at minute 5. At minute 9, at minute 14. Around minute 16, he'd stopped checking and just sat there with his hands flat on his thighs, looking at the doors. Thomas Holt, 44 years old. Sitting in a parking garage because he couldn't make himself walk through a glass door. He had walked through doors that were actively being shot at. He had stacked up outside rooms where thermal imaging showed 4 armed men on the other side. And he had been the first one through every time, not because he was fearless, but because fear had never been relevant to the question of what needed to happen next. He had breached buildings in darkness, in cold, in the particular silence before an operation that had a weight to it nothing else ever replicated. He had done all of it without pause, without the kind of hesitation that required an explanation either to himself or to anyone else. But this door, the automatic sliding kind, the kind that opened for anyone, who walked close enough he'd been looking at for 17 minutes and had not moved. Because on the other side of that door was a flight to Washington, D.C., and D.C. meant a ceremony at the Pentagon, and a ceremony meant standing in a room full of people who would look at him and call him a hero for things he couldn't describe, at a cost that was still being calculated every morning at 3 a.m. when he woke up. And the silence had too much in it. 2 of his teammates hadn't come home from Syria. Cooper, Reese. He thought their names the way he always thought them, not as a sentence, not as a memory that had edges he could locate, just as 2 points of weight that lived somewhere behind his sternum and pressed outward with a consistency that had become structural. Not pain, exactly. Not grief in the form grief usually advertised itself. Just weight. Permanent and specific, and the size of 2 men he had known better than he'd known most people in his life. The phone on the passenger seat vibrated. Jake Pruitt. Thomas didn't pick it up. He knew the contents without reading them, some variation of "you'd better already be moving," and "don't you dare do what I know you're thinking about doing," and the thoroughly unhelpful point that this was the 3rd time the ceremony had been scheduled, and the first 2 cancellations had been his fault. He turned the phone face down on the seat. Got out of the truck. He did not look like much. walking through Terminal 2. That was, in every sense, the point dark blue flannel shirt, worn soft from repetition, jeans with a fraying pocket seam. Merrill trail runners with the left heel worn down at an angle that had developed in the months since Syria, the gait compensation so slight that no one who wasn't looking for it would find it. Single black duffel bag over his left shoulder, small enough to fit in any overhead bin, carrying everything he needed for 2 nights in Washington because he traveled light by habit and by philosophy. No patches, no unit insignia, no hat with a flag on it, or a branch identifier, or anything that said this person has a military relationship with the world. Nothing that made him memorable. That was always the architecture of it. 22 years of practicing the skill, of being easy to overlook, of moving through airports and hotels and forward operating bases and foreign streets. Like something the eye skipped past without conscious decision. His call sign wasn't Ghost, because someone thought it sounded correct for a special operations soldier. It was Ghost because the men who worked alongside him in the early years kept genuinely forgetting he was in the room until the moment the room required him. And then he was already in position. And the thing was already done, and they'd look at each other and ask when exactly he had moved. He bought coffee at a kiosk near the departure board, handed over a 20 for a 240 purchase, told the young woman behind the counter to keep the change, received her thanks with a nod, and walked away without thinking about it again. That was not generosity performed for an audience. That was just the math of a person who didn't need the coins and didn't want to wait for them. The United check-in counter for Flight 2337 was at the end of a long row of identical positions. He joined the line and moved forward at the pace the line moved. And when his turn came, he handed his government-issued identification to a young man in United uniform, whose name tag read Derek, and who had the look of someone who'd been at this job long enough to develop a processing rhythm, and not quite long enough to have lost the capacity for surprise. Derek swiped the ID through the reader. Then he stopped, not a dramatic stop, not obvious. 2 seconds, maybe 2.5, the kind of pause that a person tracking the ambient information content of a room would notice and a person who was thinking about their connecting flight would not. Derek looked at the screen, looked at Thomas, looked at the screen a second time. Something moved behind his expression, not recognition in the civilian sense, not the recognition of someone who'd seen a face on television. Something more specific, the recognition of someone who had encountered a name in a context that had explained, in the way certain contexts explained certain names, what the name meant. Thomas took the boarding pass, said thank you, walked away. He did not look back. But the observation went into the ledger he kept, the running catalogue of environmental signals, that had been a professional habit for so long it no longer felt like effort. A young man at a United counter in San Diego had encountered his name and reacted to it with something other than the standard transaction. That was a data point. He filed it and kept walking. Gate 34B had the exhausted quality of late afternoon air, travel thin October light through windows that needed cleaning, the low ambient noise of 40-something people, performing the ritual of waiting in a space designed for it, but not for comfort. Thomas found a chair against the wall that gave him sightlines to both corridor approaches and the gate desk, and sat down and drank his coffee. He watched. The young woman 2 seats down was managing twin children of approximately 4 years old, with the contained fury of someone who had been doing this for a very long time today, and was rationing her remaining capacity. The man in the suit 3 rows over was producing the hunched energy of someone whose inbox was making things worse by the minute. An older couple near the windows shared a bag of chips with the synchronized ease of people who had been eating together for decades and no longer needed to negotiate. And at the far end of the gate seating, a man, 60-something, short, built in the compact, solid way that came not from any particular gym discipline, but from a body that had been asked to do real things for a long time and had adapted accordingly. Dark blue polo shirt, faded unevenly at the shoulders, in the pattern of a garment worn in sun while carrying something. plain black baseball cap with no logo, not the fashion kind, the functional kind, with a slightly curved brim and a fit that said the wearer thought of headgear's gear rather than a statement. He sat with his hands on his knees, both of them, and looked at the departure board and did not check his phone. His right hand tremored once. Small, brief, the kind of movement that had probably become invisible to the man himself through sheer familiarity. Thomas noticed, filed it, finished his coffee. The aircraft was a 737-800 in standard United configuration, and Thomas had been on enough of them to move through the boarding process without thought overhead bin. Left side closest to his seat, latch closed, duffel position so he could pull it with one motion. Seat 12A, window, left, side. He'd changed the seat assignment within 45 minutes of receiving Jake's forwarded flight confirmation, because whatever Jake had booked him was middle section, and that was not something Thomas was going to do to himself for 5 hours. Window seat meant control over the row's exit, physics. It meant a secondary surface for information outside the window, what was happening to the air around the plane, the quality of the light, the geography below. It meant a wall at his left shoulder. He chose it for reasons that were not fully rational in the context of commercial aviation, and would have been impossible to stop choosing even if he'd wanted to. The cabin, filled, pinned around him. He registered each boarding passenger with the ambient attention that never switched off. Not staring, not categorizing aggressively, just the passive data collection of a nervous system that had been calibrated for hostile environments and had never been fully recalibrated for the absence of them. The man from the gate, the one with the plain black cap and the right-hand tremor, came down the aisle and took window seat 17A on the right side of the aircraft. He stowed his single carry-on and sat down and looked at his hands for a moment, before he turned to look out his window, and in that moment of looking at his hands, Thomas registered something, not grief exactly, not its acute form, but the specific stillness of a person who had been carrying something heavy for long enough, that the carrying had become their resting position. Into 12B came a man in his mid-50s with thinning brown hair and rimless glasses and the mobilized purposefulness of someone who'd brought too much work and not enough time. He opened his laptop bag before he'd fully sat down, placed the computer with the careful precision of a person who managed their workspace in small spaces as a professional practice contractor, Thomas assessed, or mid-level federal employee, who flew frequently enough to have developed systems. Into 12C came a young woman, late 20s. Brown hair pulled back in the fast way rather than the careful way. Gray jacket over a dark shirt. Medical-style backpack that she put in the overhead with efficiency. Her eyes were reddened at the rims, not the current crying kind, the recently cried and trying to be done with it kind. She sat down and didn't look at either of the men beside her, and pulled up the window shade on the opposite side of the aircraft and looked at a fixed point on the seat back in front of her, and breathed with the deliberate quality of someone who was managing something that wanted to be less managed. Thomas looked at her for 1 second, then looked away, not his business. Civilian life ran on different rules than the environments he'd inhabited for 22 years, and one of the rules he was still finding the edges of was this one, that other people's evident pain was not automatically a thing he was responsible for addressing. In a team environment, everything that affected a person affected the mission. In an aircraft cabin flying from San Diego to Washington, people were allowed to be in private distress, without it being anyone else's operational concern. He was trying to learn this. It was slow going. Then the cockpit door opened. He had the man clocked before he'd taken 3 steps out of the flight deck. 53. Silver hair close-cropped. The build of someone who had been maintaining physical fitness as a professional practice for 3 decades. He moved with the posture of someone who had spent years in cockpits and flight suits and had never quite shed the carriage that came with them even after the flight suit was replaced by a commercial uniform. 4 stripes. Captain's bar. He walked with the directional certainty of someone going to a specific place for a specific reason. He came to row 12. Stopped. Looked at Thomas with the kind of direct, unhurried regard that developed in people who made consequential decisions under compressed timelines and had internalized that looking away cost things. The words came out quiet, pitched for the row and not the cabin. Commander Holt. Thomas looked up at him. Captain Ed Merritt. A pause that had calibration in it. VFA 143. USS Enterprise 2001 through 04. Thomas looked at him for a moment. VFA 143 was the Pukin Dogs, based out of Oceania East Coast Fleet. Strike Fighter Squadron. They'd been in the Persian Gulf in that window. Then Afghanistan. He knew the operational history. He knew what those years had looked like from 15,000 feet over terrain that was not friendly. "I know that squadron," Thomas said. "I know you do." Something in Merritt's expression moved not quite what you'd call a smile, not quite what you'd call formality. Something that occupied the space between them. "It's an honor to have you on my aircraft, sir." He turned, walked back to the cockpit. The door closed behind him. Thomas watched it. There was a question forming in the architecture of his attention, quiet, mechanical, the kind his mind generated automatically when something didn't fit the established pattern. The question was, why does the pilot know my name, and why did he come out here to say it to me? He turned the question over twice, set it down. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation, and everything to do with 9 months of trying to be a civilian, and he did not have the bandwidth to pursue every anomaly today. He looked out the window. A fuel truck was making its way toward the wing. The tarmac was flat and gray and entirely ordinary. He put his hands on his thighs and waited for wheels up. The first 30 minutes of the flight belonged to the desert. They climbed out of San Diego into air that was still warm from the day and banked east, and leveled off, and below them Arizona opened up in its vast, indifferent way, red earth and sparse vegetation, and the occasional highway cutting through the landscape like something that had been drawn rather than built. Beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when they had no interest in whether you found them so. Thomas looked at it and did not see it. He saw a street in Fallujah. A specific morning in 2005, the light arriving sideways at the angle that said the call to prayer had just finished, said the city was in that in-between state where everything was quiet, but the quiet was not peace. He'd been 25. The weight had not yet found its permanent address inside him. He was still the version of himself who thought the accumulation had a bottom. He saw the northwest corner of a second floor in Mosul. 2016. The geometry of a decision that took 3 seconds, and then had to hold for the next 8 hours, and he'd made it and held it, and it had worked. And the working of it had cost things that were separate from the working. He saw Syria, January 9 months before this Thursday. A compound in the north at coordinates he still had memorized with the same precision. He'd memorized everything that happened under extreme conditions, the detail that mattered survived intact in that particular region of memory, while other things dissolved. He'd gone in as part of a 6-man element. The perimeter had collapsed faster than the timeline allowed for. 43 people, 2 needed to exit before the reinforcements that were 40 minutes out became the reinforcements that were 3 minutes out, and the only way the math resolved was if someone stayed and held 4 walls with 1 body. He'd done the math 6 hours. 2 men hadn't come out with the 43. Cooper and Reese. He thought their names the way he always thought them, not as a story, not as a memory with a narrative shape, just as a presence that occupied specific square footage inside his chest and weighed exactly what it had always weighed, which was everything. He thought them, and let the weight be what it was, and looked at Arizona below and was somewhere else entirely. In 12C, without Thomas looking directly, the young woman reached into the inside pocket of her gray jacket and took out an envelope. It had the worn softness of paper that had been folded, opened, refolded, and opened again enough times that the creases had developed a texture the original paper didn't have. She held it without opening it, both hands gentle at the corners, the way people held objects, that carried weight that wasn't the object's own. Then she folded it back into the pocket and looked at the seat back in front of her and pressed her lips together in the careful way of someone keeping something contained that had strong preferences about being otherwise. Thomas let the observation register and go. He was not going to intrude on whatever that was. He was going to look at the desert and carry Cooper and Reese and let the flight be what it was. In 12B, the man with the rimless glasses was generating the rhythm of someone in the middle of a complex task, fingers moving with the particular cadence of a person who typed for professional reasons. Thomas caught a glimpse of the document on his screen. Department of Defense seal, top left corner. He registered it, did not try to read anything else. The man was working. The work involved a federal agency. That was the complete extent of what Thomas needed to know. 40 minutes into the flight, the footsteps came. He heard them before he processed them, the particular quality of steps coming up the aisle from behind him, deliberate and even with a slight accommodation in the cadence, the rhythm of someone who had learned to manage a limitation without calling attention to it. He did not look up immediately. He let the sound tell him what it was going to tell him. The footsteps stopped at row 12, the man from seat 17A. Up close, he was exactly the assessment Thomas had made. From the gait compact and solid, and carrying himself with the economy of movement that meant he'd worn a uniform long enough for it to become structural, the dark blue polo, the plain cap. His right hand rested on the top of the seat beside Thomas, and it was very still, and Thomas remembered the tremor from the gait and understood that the stillness was being maintained through effort. He looked at Thomas with an expression that was not the expression of someone about to make small talk. It was the expression of a man comparing something in front of him to something he'd been carrying in his head for a long time. Your ghost, not a question. A conclusion, reached through the process of checking the man in 12A against the information the man from 17A had been holding. Thomas met his gaze. I don't know who you're talking about. The man nodded, slow. Right. Of course you don't. His left hand went to the chest pocket of the polo while the right stayed on the seat back, resting. He took out a photograph, small, worn at the edges, with the softness that photographs developed when they had lived in pockets and wallets for many years, and had been handled a great many times, a young man in army service dress, standing with the slightly self-conscious posture of someone who'd been asked to stand up straight for a photograph and was doing it but was a little aware of doing it. He was grinning, the kind of grin that hadn't yet learned to be cautious. Tommy. The voice was even, controlled in the way that control was not the absence of emotion but its deliberate management by someone who had been doing that management for a long time and was very practiced at it. My son, he was killed at Ramadi in 2007. Thomas said nothing. Before his last deployment he called home, told me a story about a SEAL, callsign Ghost, who held a position on the north end of Al-Askari Street while his unit pulled back. 8 hours. Shot twice. Didn't move until the last man was clear. The right hand on the seatback tremored. The man didn't try to stop it. Tommy got out because of that. He came home. He called twice more after that. He came home for Christmas. The voice stayed level, but each sentence was placed down with the deliberateness of someone who understood the exact weight of each one and had chosen to carry them anyway. Brimsit. 6 months later, he was killed in a different city on a different operation. Not because of anything that happened on Al-Askari Street. Not because of any failure. Just because that's how it went. Ain't it? He looked at the photograph, put it back in the pocket. I don't need you to confirm anything. I don't need you to say a word. If you're the man in that story, I wanted you to know. Tommy got out. He got 6 more months. He got to call us. He got that Christmas. He removed his hand from the seat back. That's all. I thought someone should tell you. He turned, walked back down the aisle to row 17, sat, looked out his window. Thomas watched him go. He carried the name of Tommy Tanner's platoon. Had carried it for 18 years, not as a practice, not deliberately, but in the way the mind kept things that happened under the most extremes that happened under the most extreme conditions with a vividness that ordinary memory couldn't achieve. in a place that didn't respond to normal instructions about letting go. He knew exactly which building the man was talking about. He knew the broken section of the south wall that had given him a sightline. He knew the way the light changed at hour 4 and required adjustment. He knew the sound of the last man's boots going down the stairs. He couldn't say any of this. The call sign existed to protect the people who'd been in the rooms, and it meant you carried the knowledge of those rooms in a place no one else could enter. He looked out the window, desert below, red and still and completely indifferent. But what nobody in that cabin knew, not the man who had just walked back to row 17, not the contractor typing beside him, not the young woman with the letter in her jacket pocket, was that Ghost had been carrying the weight of that building and that street for almost 18 years. He knew exactly who Roy Tanner was talking about. He just couldn't say so. Not to this man, not here, not ever. 58 minutes into the flight, the encrypted phone vibrated, not the civilian device. The other one, matte black, smaller, no brand marking on the back, because it had been issued rather than purchased. He'd kept it active after retirement because the people who needed to reach him on it were not people who used civilian channels for certain kinds of information. He answered before the second vibration. Holt, Ghost, female voice, clear and fast with the efficiency of someone who made a lot of calls that needed to cover significant ground in minimal time. Sharon Lewis, Nellis. 2 minutes? Go. You're on UA 237 out of San Diego. Yes. 45 minutes ago, SOCOM received a threat notification. Someone sent a package to 3 news organizations, Post, AP, and Reuters. Contents: your legal name, your home address, your daughter's name and school, and a summary of the Syria operation. Thomas said nothing. He was looking out the window, and his hands were flat on his thighs, frangas. And he was thinking about a girl in Dallas who was 12 years old and went to school in a building he could describe from the outside, from the 3 times he'd picked her up when the custody arrangement allowed it. Emma, we don't have an identity yet, Lewis continued. What we have is authorization from SOCOM to escort UA 237 to Reagan National. Formal escort, standing order, signed by Rear Admiral Patricia Hess 42 minutes ago. Who is Hess? A beat. Half a second, the precise duration of someone deciding how much to say on this channel. That's a longer answer, and I'd rather give it to you in a context with better operational security. Short version. She has personal context you don't have yet. She had authority to move to quickly, and she moved. A pause. Ghost Jake Pruitt is part of this. How much of it? A significant portion. I can't quantify on this channel. Is my daughter in immediate danger? Physical threat assessment is low. The threat is reputational and operational, compromising your cover and the operations classification before the ceremony. Lewis's voice was precise and even. We assess that Marsh, the source of the leak, is trying to make the ceremony impossible, not targeting your family directly. Thomas was very still. The name Marsh had not yet been said on this call, and he had just heard it said. He let it sit, did not react. You said Marsh, he said, a pause. I shouldn't have. Yes, that's the working identification. We're not yet confirmed. Gary Marsh, 2019. A man who had made a calculation in a compressed moment that Thomas had been in the position to observe and document, and had documented, and the documentation had traveled through the system. The way documentation traveled, and at the end of it, Gary Marsh was no longer part of the program and carried a separation that had closed certain futures for him. Thomas had known, when he signed the report, what it would mean. He'd signed it because the alternative was to be the kind of person who observed what he'd observed and said nothing, and he was constitutionally unable to be that person. It was the least morally complex decision he'd made in 22 years. 5 years for Marsh to find a way to respond to it. 5 years of building a version of events in which Thomas Holt was the villain rather than the instrument of a system that had functioned correctly. Keep the channel open, Thomas said. He put the phone down, looked out the window. 2 points of light far to the west and below, moving with the steady purpose of aircraft on a controlled approach. Not commercial traffic. The spacing was wrong for commercial traffic, and the speed of closure was different. Military aircraft, approaching the commercial liner from a specific vector, which meant they'd been dispatched to this position from a specific point, and were executing something that had been planned and authorized. Someone had arranged this. He thought about merit coming out of the cockpit. He thought about the precision of the timing, the authorization signed 42 minutes ago, the aircraft already closing. He thought about Jake Pruitt, who had been sending messages for 3 weeks with increasing insistence, who had said in the last one, "Just get on the plane, and trust me for once in your life." Ghost. He had never been good at trust in the unconditional form. Not distrust of specific people. He trusted Jake Pruitt with things he didn't trust most people with. But the unconditional form, the form that meant surrendering the need to understand the full architecture of a situation before operating inside it, that had been trained out of him, before it had fully formed. You didn't survive in his profession by accepting that things were being managed without needing to know how they were being managed. He looked at the 2 lights nance closing on the aircraft. They were close enough now to read as aircraft, rather than points the angular profile of F-15Es Strike Eagles. Which meant Nellis, which was consistent with a scramble from the nearest available asset when authorization came through 42 minutes ago. This was not improvised. Lewis had said that. She moved quickly. Multiple people had moved quickly in the same direction. That required coordination. That required someone who knew the relevant parties and understood what each of them would do if pointed at this problem. Jake Pruitt had been that person. Thomas put his hands back on his thighs. Let the knowledge settle. Let whatever came next come. The intercom opened without the usual chime. Merritt's voice came through with the quality that Thomas had been reading in the man since the gate. The controlled authority of someone who delivered information under pressure as a professional practice, stripped of theater, carrying only what the information required and no additional load. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Merritt from the flight deck. We currently have 2 United States Air Force F-15E aircraft joining us as escort, authorized under a Department of Defense security protocol. This is a precautionary measure and there is no emergency situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you. The intercom closed. The cabin responded in stages. First the half-second of collective processing. Then the movement 40-something people, making the simultaneous decision to look out windows, the plane's attention tipping sideways, like a crowd reorienting toward a sound. Then the voices, overlapping, the register of people who understood that their ordinary experience had been interrupted by something outside the ordinary category. In 12B, the man with the rimless glasses stopped typing. He closed the laptop partway and looked out his window, and then looked at Thomas. Thomas did not return the look. He was watching Slade, which was what he now thought of the man from 12B, with the peripheral attention of someone tracking a variable. In 12C, the young woman had gone entirely still. She was looking at the seat back in front of her with the expression of someone whose internal weather had shifted and hadn't resolved into anything nameable yet. From row 7, Thomas didn't need to check. He could feel the quality of Roy Tanner's attention from 11 rows away, the stillness of a man who had seen things before and was watching this with the recognition of someone who understood what military aircraft in formation meant. The 2 F-15Es were fully visible now through the portside window. 800 feet out, holding with the unhurried precision of aircraft being handled by people who were very good at handling aircraft. They flew with the particular steadiness of controlled power. Not effortless. Nothing that size and speed was effortless, but managed so thoroughly that the effort was invisible. Thomas looked at them. He did not feel the warmth the situation might have produced in someone else. Or rather, the warmth was present, but it arrived with the same architecture as everything else, accompanied by the weight of what wasn't here to see it. Cooper and Reese. 2 men who had been better at this than almost anyone Thomas had ever worked alongside. who had gone into Syria knowing what they were going into and had not come back out, and who were not in seat 12A of United 237 watching two fighter jets hold position off the left wing. He let the warmth and the weight coexist. He was getting better at that in the 9 months since January. Not good at it. Better. Marcus Webb's voice came through the cabin PA system with a quality that didn't belong in the commercial aviation context. Not because it was out of place in its register, which was controlled and professional, but because what was underneath the control was something the PA system in a 737-800 was not normally asked to carry. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Air Force. My call sign is Torch. I'm currently flying off your left side at approximately 600 feet. The cabin was silent. The silence that assembled itself around something that commanded it rather than being asked for it. I want to explain why we're here. Not the security protocol that's real, and it's being addressed by the correct people. The other reason. The reason that doesn't appear in the authorization documentation. A pause, not theatrical. The pause of someone choosing language because the wrong word would do something that couldn't be undone. 12 years ago, I was flying a two-ship out of Bagram. My wingman went down on egress mechanical, bad terrain, the kind of thing that happens at the edge of the performance envelope in conditions the aircraft wasn't designed for. He survived the crash. He would not have survived the next 4 hours without intervention. Thomas looked at the F-15E through the window, held steady. 600 feet, a SEAL came off an adjacent operation and pulled him out of the wreckage. Carried him 400 meters under fire, held the position for 90 minutes until medevac could get in. My wingman went home. He's a major now in Tucson. He has 2 kids who call him Dad. The voice moved fractionally, not losing control, but something under the control shifted weight. I never got to thank the man responsible. I spent 12 years thinking about that. The cabin was still holding its silence. The man in seat 12A is Commander Thomas Holt, United States Navy SEALs, retired. Call sign Ghost, 22 years of service. Earlier this year in January, he held a defensive position alone in a classified operation for 6 hours so that 43 Americans could get out. He was wounded twice during those 6 hours. 2 members of his team did not make it home. Outside, the Strike Eagles flew their pattern, steady, completely steady. He is on this flight today to receive a decoration he has already declined twice. A longer pause. Commander Holt, on behalf of every pilot in the 43rd Fighter Squadron, and on behalf of Lieutenant Brannigan, who is now Major Brannigan, and who still talks about you, it is an honor to be flying your wing today. It always has been. The intercom closed. The cabin did not erupt. That word implied something undirected, something that happened to a group rather than a thing a group chose to do. What happened instead was deliberate. One person began to applaud. Near the front, then another, and the response traveled backward through the aircraft in a wave that took about 4 seconds to reach the rear, and by the time it reached the rear, it had become something unanimous, something 47 people had independently arrived at. Thomas looked at the Strike Eagles. He did not look at the cabin. He looked at Torch Webb's aircraft holding position and thought about a night in Afghanistan in 2014 and a man trapped in a downed aircraft and the math that said going back in was the correct move, and about the fact that the correct move and the survivable move had not been guaranteed to be the same move, and that he'd done the math and gone anyway, because that was what the math required. He had not done it to be owed anything. He had not thought about Torch Webb in 12 years. He had thought about the man in the wreckage, about the extraction, about the position he'd held and what it cost to hold it, the way he thought about all of it, as a series of decisions that had been correct and had cost things and had produced outcomes without the narrative of heroism that other people layered over it from the outside. The applause went on. Long enough to be genuine, long enough to be something more than politeness. In 12B, William Slade Thomas had been calling him Slade in his head since the DOD seal on the screen had not applauded. He had opened his laptop and was typing with a speed and focus that suggested the applause was information he was responding to, operationally rather than emotionally. He looked at Thomas once, briefly, with the expression of a man who had processed something and was acting on the processing. In 12C, the young woman had gone still in a different way than before. Not the managed stillness of someone containing something. The stillness of someone who had reached a decision. The applause finally settled. The cabin exhaled. The quality of the silence that followed was different from any silence that had preceded it on this flight. Not waiting silence, not anxious silence, but the silence of people who had arrived somewhere and were still inside the arrival. Slade closed his laptop all the way. Looked at Thomas with the clear, direct attention that had characterized every interaction he'd had with his environment, since Thomas had first registered him. William Slade, not introductory in tone. Identificatory, duty contractor. Logistics analysis for special operations programs. I hold TS/SSCI clearance. Thomas looked at him and waited. 20 minutes before I boarded, I received a threat notification through my internal reporting chain. The same threat Lewis briefed you on. A pause. I know Sharon Lewis by function, not personally. I recognized the chain when the notification moved through it. You know what the notification contained? Name, home address, daughter's name and school, operation summary. Slade said it, the way analysts said things that needed to be said clearly and without the distortion of personal reaction. I also know what the Syria operations numbers represent, because I ran the post-operation logistics assessment. 43 personnel extracted, 2 non-survivors. I know what resources were staged, what the timeline required, what had to go correctly for 43 people to get out of that compound alive. Thomas was quiet. I've been writing a supplemental report for the past 40 minutes, Slade said, recommending armored transport from Reagan National to your hotel rather than standard civilian ground transportation, pending identification of the threat source. He held Thomas's gaze. I'm aware you didn't request that. I didn't. No. Something in Slade's expression shifted not discomfort, but its analytical neighbor. The 2 non-survivors, he said. I run numbers. I've been running numbers on operations like this for 14 years. The numbers give you outcomes. They don't give you names. What were their names? Thomas looked at him. At the contained competence of this man, the careful removal of affect from his professional communication, and at this question, which was not professional at all. Cooper and Reese. Slade nodded once. Precise. Cooper and Reese. He repeated the names in the tone of someone writing them into a different kind of record. I'll carry that. He did not say anything else. He reached for his laptop and put it in his bag, and sat with his hands folded and looked at the seat back in front of him. The conversation was over, not because it had been cut short, but because everything it needed to contain had been placed correctly. And adding more would have disturbed the placement. In 12C, the young woman spoke without turning her head. The particular quality of not turning that said the thing being said was hard enough without also having to meet someone's eyes. My name is Stephanie Calloway. Quiet and even. My father was HM2 Patrick Calloway, Navy corpsman. He was killed in Kandahar in 2012. Thomas gave the sentence the space it required. I'm flying to Washington for a ceremony tomorrow. There's a clinic at Bethesda Naval Medical Center. They named it after him. I'm going to the dedication. She stopped. Her hands in her lap were very still. My father used to say that corpsmen could do their job because certain other people made space for them to work. He said the people who moved first, who pushed the perimeter out, who gave him 30 seconds where there had been no seconds, those were the people he was actually working with, even when they weren't in the same unit. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, your father ran toward noise for a living. He didn't need anyone to create conditions for him. He chose the conditions every single time he showed up. Stephanie looked at the seat back, and something in her face received that the particular way a face received something it had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. She nodded once, small. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, and held the envelope, pocket, and held the envelope for a moment, not pulling it out, just placing her hand over it the way you placed your hand over something you needed to confirm was still there. "He wrote me a letter," she said, "before his last deployment. Gave it to my mother and told her to give it to me when I graduated medical school. My mother gave it to me last week because she thought I needed it before graduation." She touched the outside of the pocket. "I've read it every morning since." Thomas didn't ask what it said. He understood that what it said was not for this conversation. That the letter was between Stephanie Calloway and her father, and he was not part of that. He understood that she had told him as much as was appropriate to tell him, and had offered it as the context. It was the explanation of why she was on this flight, where she was going, what she was carrying. "He sounds like someone who understood what the work was for," Thomas said. "He did," Stephanie said. "He always did," and that was where they left it. The conversation sealed itself the way conversations did, when they had said their complete thing, not abruptly, not cut short, but with the quiet recognition that the right amount had been said, and more would be too much. Roy Tanner came down the aisle a second time. The first time had been tentative in a way that was specific and recognizable, the walk of a man approaching something he'd rehearsed extensively in his head and was uncertain about in the physical world. This time was different. This time he moved with the quality of someone who had made a decision and was executing it, the tentativeness replaced by a forward momentum that was quiet but not hesitant. He came from row 17 with both hands at his sides, not touching the seatbacks for balance, navigating the narrow aisle with the practiced economy of a body that had moved through constrained spaces for a long time. He stopped at row 12. Looked at Thomas. The comparison function was gone from his expression. The first time he'd been checking Thomas against something measuring the man in 12A, against an image he'd been carrying in his mind for 18 years, looking for the correspondence. That process was complete. What was in his face now was something that had come after the checking, something that occupied the space the uncertainty had vacated. Ghost. No question in it, no tentativeness. The word placed down like something being set on a table after a long time of being held. Thomas met his eyes. "Tanner." Roy Tanner looked at Thomas for a long moment with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment in enough variations over enough years, that the actual moment had become something he didn't quite have a script for, which was perhaps the only version of the moment that could have been adequate. 18 years, he said. "I've been carrying this 18 years. Not looking. Exactly, I'm not a man who chases things I can't find, but carrying it. The story Tommy told me. The name in it. The idea of the man the name belonged to." He stopped. His jaw moved once slightly, the small motion of a person maintaining composure through an act of will. "I've told it to maybe a dozen people over the years. At VFW meetings. At my brother-in-law's kitchen table. At a grief group the VA made me attend after the first year, which I hated every minute of, and which I will also acknowledge probably did more for me than I'll ever say directly." The right hand hung at his side. Thomas could see the tremor in it, from where he sat, the Parkinson's presenting without the management effort Roy had been applying earlier, and the absence of management effort said something about where Roy's attention was. He felt teen insi me. "You know what nobody did," Roy said when I told it. Thomas waited. Nobody sat still. The voice was precise and deliberate in the way of a man who had reduced something to its actual shape over a very long time. They always responded. Asked a question, made a noise, said they were sorry, reached over and put a hand on my arm. Every time. Some version of intervention. He looked at Thomas with the clarity of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through extensive evidence. "You just sat there, when I walked away the first time. You looked. That was all, a pause. That's how I knew." Thomas said nothing. There was a complete absence of anything adequate to say, not because the moment was overwhelming, but because Roy Tanner had just described the most specific possible method of identification and had been right, and any response Thomas might offer would be either a confirmation he wasn't authorized to give or a deflection that would insult both of them. He held Roy's gaze and let the silence be the silence. Roy Tanner reached up with his right hand, the one that tremored, and brought it to the brim of his plain black cap. A salute. Not the sharp, recent practice kind that came from someone who'd been on an active installation recently. The kind that came from muscle memory so old it lived below the level of training, in the part of the body that remembered things the conscious mind had long since stopped actively maintaining. It had the slight imprecision of Parkinson's in it, and it had 18 years of a father looking for the man who'd given his son 6 more months. And it was the most specific salute Thomas had ever received. Thomas stood up, in the narrow aisle of a commercial aircraft, with the overhead bins above him and the cabin pressing in on both sides. He returned the salute with full formality. Hand sharp, eye contact maintained, the complete form of it, held for a moment before his hand came down. Roy Tanner looked at him for one more beat. Then he turned and walked back down the aisle to row 17 and sat down, and this time he did not reach into the chest pocket of his polo. He put both hands on his knees, flat and still, and he looked out his window at the 2 strike eagles on holding formation off the port side, and the thing that had changed in the set of his shoulders said that something he'd been carrying at a particular angle for a very long time had been set down, and he was still figuring out what his body felt like without the specific weight of it. Sometimes silence is the only answer that fits, and sometimes the right response to 18 years of carrying something is not words at all. It is one man standing up in a narrow aisle and saying the true thing without language, because language had been tried in this situation by many people over many years and had always fallen short of the actual size of what needed to be said. The cabin had been watching, not intrusively, not with the open-mouthed attention of people witnessing something designed for an audience, with the quiet attention of people who understood they were inside something private that had nonetheless happened in their presence. No one spoke. The moment closed itself without interference. Thomas sat back down, put his hands on his thighs, looked out the window at the desert far below, still red, still vast, still entirely indifferent to the specific gravity of what was happening in the pressurized tube crossing above it. The man in seat 27C had been building toward something for 20 minutes and had finally decided to do it. Thomas heard him before he saw him, the quality of movement coming up the aisle, with the forward momentum of someone who had constructed a case and was bringing it to the relevant authority. 42, maybe 43. The jacket had been expensive once, in the way things were expensive once, and then became merely nice. The face of someone for whom inconvenience was the most serious category of problem currently available. He stopped in the aisle at roughly the midpoint of the cabin, pitched his voice for general audience rather than specific individual, and said, "I understand we're in a complicated situation, and I have genuine respect for what veterans do. But this flight was delayed 20 minutes on the runway, and I have a 6 o'clock meeting in DC with people who traveled from 3 different states, and I think it would be reasonable to ask whether there was a way to handle whatever this is that didn't affect every other person on this aircraft." He stopped speaking because Roy Tanner, from row 17, had turned in his seat. He didn't stand. He turned the measured turn of someone who has determined that something has gotten their attention and has decided to give it a specific and limited amount of that attention. He looked at the man in the jacket with an expression that was not anger, not hostility, something that required more precision to name than either of those, the expression of someone who has been past the place where other people's inconvenience registers on their scale for so long that returning to that place is not possible even briefly. "My son was killed in Iraq," Roy said. His voice was level, not raised, not weighted with performance, just the flat statement of a fact that had become the central organizing fact of his life, and which he had long since stopped needing to manage for the comfort of people who encountered it. He made it out of one of the worst nights of that war because the man in seat 12A stood between him and what was coming. "My son came home for Christmas that year. He came home 6 months after that as well, and that time he didn't come back. He looked at the man in the jacket, without heat, without the effort of anger, with only the clear, patient attention of someone for whom this comparison had already been made so many times that making it one more time cost almost nothing. You can sit down and be quiet for 20 minutes. I've been doing it for 18 years. The man in the jacket sat down. The cabin did not respond with noise. What happened was quieter, a collective exhale, a settling, a redistribution of attention back towards stillness. And then, from near the front, a woman said, "Thank you," in a voice that was barely above a murmur, not to anyone specific. The thanks wasn't directed at Roy Tanner or at Thomas or at any individual person. It was directed at the general principle that Roy had just articulated in the particular way he'd articulated it, quietly, and without decoration, and without the need for the person receiving it to feel comfortable. How often do we walk into a room convinced that our inconvenience is the most important thing happening without any knowledge of what the person beside us has already lived through? The answer, of course, is constantly. The correction, when it comes, is always humbling, and it never comes gently enough. In 12C, Stephanie Calloway had the letter out again, still in the envelope, still folded. She was holding it with both thumbs pressing gently at the lower corner. The gesture Thomas had noticed before, and she was not reading it. She'd made clear she didn't need to read it, that she had it memorized. She was just holding the physical object that connected her to a specific person, the last form of contact that remained available. She was looking at the seat back in front of her and doing something interior and private that Thomas let be interior and private. In 12B, Slade had gone still. Not the working stillness of earlier, when his stillness was the stillness of someone actively processing information. A different kind, the stillness of someone who had put the work down and was just being present in the space, which Thomas suspected was not Slade's natural mode and was costing him something to maintain. Outside, the two F-15s continued their pattern, steady. 800 feet. The sun was beginning to change angle in the way it changed in the late afternoon in October at this latitude, coming in lower, catching the upper surfaces of the escort aircraft and making them briefly gold against the blue that was deepening toward the color it would be in another hour. Thomas watched it, let himself watch it without the automatic impulse to file and move on. Just watched. The encrypted phone vibrated. Sharon Lewis. Same channel. Thomas answered on the first cycle. Update. Her voice was moving at a different pace now, not the careful, measured pace of the first call, the pace of someone working through a lot of information quickly and selecting what was relevant. "We have a confirmed identity on the source of the leak." Thomas said nothing. Waiting, former Chief Petty Officer, SEAL Program. Separated 2019, he was already there. His mind had already moved to that year with the smooth efficiency of a filing system that organized itself around operational significance. 2019, the file was very clear. "Say the name," Thomas said. "Gary Marsh." He closed his eyes 2 seconds, opened them. Arizona was gone. They were over New Mexico now, the landscape below shifting from the pure red geometry of the desert into something more varied, more broken. The beginnings of the terrain that would eventually become the Rockies. Gary Marsh. Chief Petty Officer. SEAL Team 3. Separated with prejudice in the autumn of 2019 following a military review board, proceeding that had been initiated by a formal report submitted by Commander Thomas Holt. The report had described, in the factual and unemotional language that military reports required, what Marsh had done in a moment when the decision he'd made had been the wrong decision in a way that Thomas could not document, and then choose not to document. Marsh had made the calculation that a wounded teammate was slowing the extraction timeline in a way that the extraction timeline could not accommodate, and he had acted on that calculation. Thomas had written the report because there was no alternative version of himself, that existed no version of Thomas Holt that could observe what he'd observed and then decide that the report was optional. He'd known when he signed it what the consequences would be for Marsh. He'd signed it anyway, because the consequences for Marsh were a direct result of what Marsh had done, and the chain of responsibility was clear, and Thomas's job was to document what had happened, and let the system do what systems existed to do. 5 years. Marsh had carried it for 5 years, and had built a story in which the villain of the story was the man who had written the report, rather than the man who had provided the material for the report. That was a very human thing to do. Thomas had no contempt for it. People rewrote causation under extreme emotional pressure, all the time located a proximate cause that wore a human face. And directed the weight toward the face rather than toward the sequence of decisions that had actually produced the outcome. He had contempt for one specific thing, the name of a 12-year-old girl sent to a news organization as part of a play to prevent a ceremony. Emma. 12 years old. In a school in Dallas on a Thursday afternoon, doing whatever she did on Thursday afternoons, with no knowledge of any of this. My daughter, Thomas said. Safe. Lewis's voice was immediate and precise. Dallas PD has eyes on the house. She's at school. She doesn't know anything is happening. Your ex-wife has been notified through the appropriate channel. She is concerned, but she is managing it, and she asked that you be told Emma is fine and does not know. Thomas breathed through it. Let the knowledge that Emma was safe do what it needed to do to the particular quality of the tension that had been present since Lewis had said her name on the first call. Marsh's location, Thomas said, we have an endpoint. Federal assets are working it. I'm expecting a location within 30 to 40 minutes. When you have it, you'll know before I put it in writing. A pause. The careful pause of someone about to ask something they've evaluated the utility of asking. Ghost, how are you doing up there? Thomas looked at the escort aircraft, still holding still. Steady. Keep the channel open, he said. He put the phone down. In 12B, Slade was watching him with the contained attention of someone who had heard the shape of the conversation through the available fragments and had assembled the picture. He didn't ask. He met Thomas's eyes briefly, and in the meeting there was the specific acknowledgement of one person who operated in classified environments to another, the shared understanding that certain things were happening. And that the correct response to certain things happening was operational rather than emotional. Before Thomas looked back at the window, Gary Marsh. The thing that kept finding its way to the surface, past the operational assessment of the threat, and past the relief about Emma's safety, and past the administrative fact of the federal response. The thing that kept arriving uninvited was this. He had written that report because it was the only correct thing to do, and it had been the only correct thing to do. And he would write it again without hesitation, and Marsh had built 5 years of directed weight on the back of Thomas, having done the only correct thing. And the weight had landed on Emma's name being in a package sent to 3 news organizations. He sat with that. He didn't try to resolve it. Some things didn't resolve into anything cleaner than what they were, and the correct relationship with those things was to see them clearly, and not dress them up with meaning they hadn't earned. He put his hands flat on his thighs. The flight continued east. The escort continued to hold. Below, the landscape moved through its geological changes without noticing any of it. The encrypted phone rang a second time. Different prefix. Thomas looked at it for 1 full second before answering, because the prefix was the kind that required a second. Halt. Ghost. The voice arrived with the specific quality of command authority that had been internalized so completely. It no longer needed performance, not the performance of authority, just the thing itself in the voice, in the rhythm of the sentence, in the way the single word carried the assumption that it would be received correctly. Patricia Hess. Thomas sat straighter. Not a decision, a conditioned response that 22 years had written into his spine at a level below conscious instruction. Admiral, I'm on a flight out of San Francisco. Back to DT this evening. A pause. I signed the escort authorization 45 minutes ago. I want you to hear the reason directly from me, not through the reporting chain. I'm listening, Admiral. First reason is operational. The Marsh situation is real. The threat to your identity and to the operations classification is real. And the escort is the appropriate response to the threat assessment. That reason is sufficient on its own and stands independent of everything else. Another pause. This one had a different quality, not the pause of information being sequenced, but the pause of a person moving from one category of communication to another. The second reason is personal, which I don't usually lead with. In this case, I've decided you've earned the transparency. Thomas said nothing. My son is Captain David Hess. He was the intelligence element lead on the Syria extraction in January. He was the 15th person to exit the compound. The number arrived in Thomas's chest with the specific gravity of something he already carried and was now being asked to see from a different angle. 15. He knew 15. He had watched 15 cross the perimeter, young face under the helmet, moving with the focused speed of someone who understood that speed was the thing keeping them alive, and Thomas had registered the successful transit of 15. The Sestoli, Wehimo, all of them, as a subtraction from the total number that still needed to move, and an addition to the number that had made it. He hadn't known the name. He'd never needed the name. When David called from Ramstein, Hess continued, her voice holding the same level quality it had maintained throughout, the kind of level that was not the absence of something underneath, but the management of something that warranted management. The first thing he asked me before he asked about leave, before he asked about his father, before he asked about anything that concerned his own life going forward, was whether Ghost had gotten out. Thomas was quiet. He got out, Thomas said. The simplest version of the true thing, because of what you did, a fractional movement in her voice. So small that in a different context, Thomas might have missed it. In this context, he heard it clearly. I am a flag officer. I understand the arithmetic of command. I have sent people into conditions that required sending them in, and I have carried the outcomes of that. I am not contacting you as his mother. She stopped. A complete stop, the length of an actual breath. But I want you to understand that when I had the authority to make a statement about what this country is for a man who held a position in Syria, so that 43 people could get out, I made that statement. As quickly as I could make it, Thomas looked at the strike eagles outside the window, 600 feet. Not wavering by a single degree. The ceremony tomorrow, Hess said. I know you've declined it twice through the official channel. I know why. I'm not asking you to want it or to find it adequate or to feel about it the way the people organizing it feel about it. I'm asking you to consider what it is for the other 43 people. It's the record. It's the moment when what happened in January is officially acknowledged to have happened. To have cost what it cost, and to have been worth it, they need that moment. They need the record to exist, he thought about Cooper and Reese. He thought about the arithmetic of their names against 43, and whether the arithmetic ever resolved into something that made sense to him. And the honest answer was that it didn't and probably wouldn't, and that the inability of the arithmetic to resolve was not a reason to refuse the record. I'll be at the ceremony, Thomas said. Good. The authority came back into her voice in the way it came back after a personal thing had been said, not harder, just more precisely placed. Clear skies, Commander. The call ended. Thomas held the phone for a moment, put it in his pocket, looked out the window. The light was changing. Late afternoon over the mid-Atlantic, the sun dropping toward the angle that made things gold rather than bright. The strike eagles caught it on their upper surfaces, and for a moment, each aircraft had a brief, gilt edge to it, the angular shapes that were designed for function rather than beauty becoming briefly beautiful in the accidental way of things. Catching particular light at particular angles, he looked at them and thought about David Hess, 15 across the perimeter, asking from a hospital in Germany where the Ghost had gotten out. He thought about Roy Tanner's son calling home 3 days before his last deployment to tell the story of Alaskari Street. He thought about Stephanie Calloway's father, writing a letter that said, "Become the kind who runs toward the noise." He thought about Ed Merritt volunteering for a specific flight 3 weeks in advance because Jake Pruitt had asked him, and because Merritt had his own reasons for saying yes. There was a difference. He was beginning to understand in the 9 months since Syria, between being invisible and being alone. He had chosen invisibility as a professional posture, and it had served the mission and served the people around him for 22 years. But invisibility was not the same as isolation, and he had been treating them as identical. And that confusion had costs he hadn't been fully accounting for. In 12B, Slade had put away his laptop and was sitting with his hands folded on his tray table, looking at nothing with the focused inwardness of a man doing active internal work. In 12C, Stephanie Calloway had put the letter away again and was looking out the starboard window at the sky that held nothing but sky, and her face had the quality of someone who had been through something in the past 3 hours and was still integrating it. Roy Tanner. 11 rose back, sat with both hands on his knees and looked out at the escort aircraft, and was very still. The managing stillness was gone. This was just stillness. Thomas looked at the window, and beyond the window at the aircraft holding position, and beyond the aircraft at the sky, which was doing what the sky did in October over the mid-Atlantic in the late afternoon, which was everything, slowly, in the direction of dark. The sound came through the airframe before it came through the window. Thomas felt it rather than heard it first, a change in the acoustic environment. Something in the engine noise of one of the escort aircraft shifting in the specific way that a shift in power output shifted it. Not alarm. Precision. The sound of something being done exactly as it had been briefed. He turned to the window. The lead F-15E was climbing. Not sharply, smoothly, with the kind of controlled deliberateness that meant a specific maneuver was being executed to specification. It climbed and rolled slightly, and the afternoon light caught it at the apex, the angular silhouette going briefly brilliant against the deepening blue. And then it banked away wide, and the afterburner lit a brief, clean flare of orange, there and gone in under 2 seconds, and the aircraft climbed out of the formation and disappeared into the altitude above. Missing man. First position, Thomas understood it in the first second. His body understood it before his mind fully articulated it, the recognition of a ritual he had witnessed in other contexts, at memorials, at funeral flyovers, the formation that flew one aircraft, short to say what words had tried and failed to say adequately. He had seen it performed for the dead. He had never seen it performed for the living. The second strike eagle followed. Same arc, same controlled climb, same brief burn at the apex, the orange flare catching the light and fading as the aircraft rolled out and climbed away. Then the lead F-16. The one he knew was Karen Brannigan's. She climbed, with the same precision the strike eagles had shown. The Falcon's narrower profile, cutting a slightly different shape against the sky, and at the top of the arc she lit her burner and banked hard right, and the aircraft went up and away with a directness that said nothing ceremonial about it at all. It said, "This is the correct thing to do, and I am doing it correctly." It was the most precise expression of respect Thomas had ever been inside of. Not because it was large, because it was exact. Because someone had looked at the situation and identified what form of acknowledgement was equal to it, and the form was this. 4 aircraft, a missing man formation, executed over American airspace, by pilots who had their own reasons to be here, and who had brought those reasons at their own initiative. The last F-16 held its position for a moment longer than the others, still off the port wing. Thomas looked at it, the canopy, the anonymous visor, the complete absence of a visible face behind the equipment that was designed to make the person inside the aircraft effective and interchangeable. Then it executed the same arc, the same climb, the same precise afterburner that was there and gone. Gone, the 737 descended alone. The escort had discharged its formation, and the aircraft continued downward through the priority corridor that ATC had opened, and the sky around the commercial liner was empty of everything, except air and ATAB and altitude, and the particular silence that followed something significant. Thomas looked at the empty sky where the 4 aircraft had been. He was not going to cry. He was not going to cry. He had not cried in any way that anyone would recognize as crying in 9 months, and he was not going to start now, at 35,000 feet over the Virginia border. What was moving through him didn't need that expression. It required something quieter, the interior acknowledgement of someone who had been carrying something at a specific angle for a long time and had just been shown, by 4 aircraft peeling away into October sky, that the angle wasn't mandatory. Cooper and Reese, Tommy Tanner, Patrick Calloway, the 43. He held all of it together without trying to resolve it into a ratio or a lesson or a meaning that made the weight acceptable. The weight was the weight. It was not going to become lighter by being reframed. It was going to be carried because it was real, and because what was real deserved to be carried honestly, and because the alternative, the managed distance, the practiced invisibility, the 9 months of trying to become a person who existed quietly and asked nothing of anyone, had not made it lighter. It had just made him alone with it. Merritt's voice through the intercom was quiet and unhurried in the way of a man who had finished saying the things that needed saying and had only one practical thing left to communicate. Ladies and gentlemen, we're approximately 12 minutes from Reagan National. ATC has us in a priority corridor for arrival. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in the upright position. We'll be on the ground shortly. The cabin complied. The sounds of people preparing, the click of tray tables, the rustle of bags being shifted, the specific quality of a group of people settling into the last phase of something that had been much more than a flight. In 17A, Roy Tanner reached into his chest pocket, took out the photograph, looked at Tommy for a long moment, not the brief glance of someone confirming that the photograph was still there, but the full attention of someone choosing to see a specific face at a specific moment. Then he put it in his wallet. Not the pocket, the wallet. The place where you kept things that you intended to carry with you every day going forward, in the way that you carried things that were no longer about grief and were now just about memory. Thomas saw this through the reflection in the window glass. Said nothing, but he registered it with the same precision. He registered everything as a data point, as a small but complete event, as evidence that something had shifted in the past 2 hours. For a man who had been carrying a pocket photograph for 18 years. In 12C, Stephanie Calloway looked out the starboard window, and the landscape below had changed from the green of the Appalachians to the denser, more fragmented terrain of the mid-Atlantic, the suburbs becoming visible, the arteries of interstate highway coming into the picture, and eventually, at the edge of what was visible, the particular flatness that preceded the Potomac. She watched it come with the attention of someone who had been here before and was seeing it differently this time. In 12B, Slade put his hands flat on his tray table and looked at the seat back in front of him, with the clear eyes of a man who had run the numbers on what this afternoon had been and had arrived at a conclusion. He did not share the conclusion. He didn't need to. Thomas had a reasonable working hypothesis about what it was. Outside, the Virginia landscape resolved out of the haze, rooftops and tree lines and the glint of water, the Potomac appearing at the edge of the descent path, silver and wide and moving at its own pace without any awareness of the aircraft descending toward the airspace above it. Then the monuments, briefly visible in the angle of approach, the white spear of the Washington Monument, the dome of the Capitol building, catching the last direct light of the afternoon, the green geometry of the mall between them. Thomas looked at it, the city where the record was kept, where service was supposed to be accounted for, where the decisions made in classified rooms in other time zones were eventually brought back and placed in the official ledger that said, "This happened. It mattered. It cost something. It was done in the name of something larger than any individual who participated in it." He was going there, with Roy Tanner's son's story in his chest, and Stephanie Calloway's father's letter in the knowledge of what it contained, and 43 people who had needed a 6-hour window, and Cooper and Reese and Jake Pruitt and Ed Merritt and 4 aircraft that had peeled away into October sky, and the specific weight of all of it, which was not going to become easier and was not supposed to become easier and was the honest relationship with what had actually happened. The aircraft descended. Reagan National came into the approach picture. The runway threshold lights appeared below at the correct angle and the correct spacing, and Merritt brought the aircraft down with the smooth authority of 30 years of practice, and the wheels touched with a gentleness that belied the size and the speed and the weight of everything that had been in the air today. And the reverse thrust came in measured, and the aircraft slowed, and the lights of the airport moved past the windows, and the flight was over. Thomas put his hands flat on the armrests. They were on the ground. He was here. Whatever came next was going to come next. He was ready for it, not in the way of someone who had processed everything, resolved everything, and arrived at peace, but in the way of someone who understood that readiness was not the same as resolution, and that the work ahead was not going to be done through avoidance. He was his. He was going to stay here. He was going to stand on a platform tomorrow and let 43 people have the record they needed, and he was going to carry Cooper and Reese into that room, and that would be the right way to carry them, not as evidence that the ceremony was wrong, but as proof that the ceremony was necessary. The aircraft taxied. The gate approached. The jetway extended. The Thomas reached for his duffel. The jetway smelled of jet fuel and the specific industrial warmth of airport infrastructure that existed nowhere else, the particular combination of recycled air and mechanical systems, and the residual heat of aircraft that had been sitting in October sun all day. Thomas made the 30-second walk from the aircraft door to the main terminal corridor alone. Which was the correct way to make it. He came through the security barrier into the arrivals hall. One person was standing there. Jake Pruitt, 47 years old, dark polo shirt, jeans, running shoes, the particular civilian uniform of a man who spent his professional life in environments where uniforms were either mandatory or completely inadvisable, and had arrived at a default for the spaces between. His hands were in his pockets. His weight was shifted slightly to the left in the stance of someone who had been standing in a specific spot long enough to have redistributed himself toward comfort. He looked at Thomas the way you looked at someone you'd known for 20 years and had been carrying a specific worry about for 9 months and had spent 3 weeks building a complicated logistical architecture around, without being entirely certain the architecture would hold. Thomas looked at him. Ghost, Jake said. Jake, Thomas said. And then Jake Pruitt crossed the distance between them and put his arms around his friend with the grip of someone who was checking something, confirming that the person was still present, still coherent, still the person he'd known rather than the diminished version of that person he'd been afraid might be what arrived at the gate. He held it for long enough that the checking was complete. Then he stepped back. Thomas looked at him. You knew about Merritt, yes, and Webb, yes, and Lewis. And part of the Hess authorization, correct on all of those. Jake held his gaze without defensiveness. I also made a call to Admiral Hess's office 2 weeks ago, though I want to be clear that she made her own decision based on her own reasons, and I only made the introduction. Roy Tanner? Something shifted in Jake's expression. Roy called me. Not the other way. He'd been connected to a veteran advocacy group that monitors naval special warfare events for years, not in a surveillance way, in the way of someone who needed to stay adjacent to information about operations and personnel in a particular theater and time period. When the ceremony announcement went through a channel the group tracked, he found a contact number. He worked his way through it and ended up talking to me. A pause. I told him what I could. Stephanie Calloway. Her mother contacted the veteran liaison at Bethesda Medical Center 3 months ago, trying to find out if anyone connected to SEAL operations who had worked alongside Navy Corps men might attend the clinic dedication. The liaison is a friend of mine. She called me. Jake looked at Thomas with the expression of someone who has done something complicated and is not apologizing for it, but is willing to be accountable for it. I didn't manufacture any of this. Ghost. I was in a position to see the pieces and I put them in proximity to each other. Thomas was quiet for a moment. The arrivals hall moved around them, other passengers from other flights, the ordinary traffic of a Thursday evening at Reagan National. People going to and from things that had nothing to do with Syria or missing man formations or encrypted phones or the name Gary Marsh. "You could have told me," Thomas said. "You would have gotten off the plane." He considered this. It was true without qualification. If Jake had called him 3 weeks ago and described what he was building, the pilot, the escort squadron, Roy Tanner on the same flight, Stephanie Calloway connected to the Bethesda ceremony, Thomas would have changed his ticket to a different carrier on a different day and arrived in Washington 24 hours later by a route that nobody knew about. He would have attended the ceremony and accepted the medal and been back on a plane to San Diego before anyone had time to turn it into something he'd have to experience, rather than simply endure. Except he would have missed Roy Tanner sitting down and looking at his hands with the expression of a man who had set down something he'd been carrying at a specific angle for 18 years. "You're right," Thomas said. Jake blinked. "Say that again." "I'm not going to." Something moved in Jake's face, the controlled version of being pleased, which in Jake Pruitt manifested as a slight change in the quality of stillness around his mouth. "Emma is safe. Marsh was picked up 50 minutes ago. Your ex-wife knows the situation is resolved." Emma didn't know anything was happening and still doesn't. Thomas nodded. Let the confirmation settle into the place where the tension about Emma had been sitting since Lewis had first said her name. "Marsh," Thomas said. "I know. I wrote that report because it was the only thing to write. I know that." And he sent Emma's name to 3 news organizations. He did. Jake held his gaze steadily, and he'll have a significant amount of time in a federal context to think about that decision. Ghost, what Marsh chose to do with the outcome of your report is his responsibility, not yours. The report was correct. The review board was correct. The separation was correct. You followed the process that exists because the process exists for exactly that reason. Marsh's response to correct process is a problem Marsh created. A pause. I want you to hear that clearly. Thomas looked at his friend, at the lines that hadn't been there a decade ago, and the gray at his temples, and the eyes that were doing the thing Jake's eyes did. When he was telling the truth about something, he'd spent real effort on the particular quality of openness, the thing available to be taken without being forced. "I hear it," Thomas said. "Good." Jake glanced toward the exit. "There's an armored vehicle at arrivals level. Driver's name is Farrell, government plates. He knows who you are. Hotel is 10 minutes. Ceremony is at 10:00 tomorrow. I'll pick you up at 8:30. You booked a flight back to Dallas after the ceremony. 9 p.m. Reagan to Dallas Love Field. Already confirmed." Thomas looked at him. "You booked it 3 weeks ago." Jake didn't even try to look apologetic about this. "You were always going to want to see Emma after. You just didn't know yet that you were going to want it enough to book it yourself. I saved you the step." They walked toward the exits, side by side, the way they'd walked in a significant number of different places. Over 20 years, not synchronized, not performing anything, just 2 men moving in the same direction, because that was where they were going, and they had always moved better in the same direction than in different ones. The exit doors opened onto the arrivals drop-off lane, and beyond it the long view across the Potomac toward the Virginia bank, and the last of the day's light was doing what October light did. At this hour, over this part of the country, everything orange at the water's edge, and fading upward into the particular blue-gray that belonged specifically to this latitude and this season and this time of early evening. The Washington Monument was visible at distance, white and vertical against the fading sky. Thomas stopped just outside the doors. Not because he was uncertain about the direction, because the view warranted a moment and he was going to give it one. Jake, still here. Cooper and Reese. Jake was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who didn't know what to say. Jake Pruitt always knew what to say. The quiet of someone choosing the right version of what to say from among the available versions. "I know, I think about them every day. I know you do. I don't know if that changes." "I don't think it stops," Jake said. His voice was level and honest in the way it was when he'd thought about something a long time before the conversation arrived. What I think changes is what it means to keep going anyway. The keeping going and the carrying become separate operations instead of the same operation. They stop having to resolve each other. He looked at the water. That's what I think. I could be wrong. Thomas looked at the monument, at the city spreading out beneath the fading sky, at the place where the record was kept. Grief was not the enemy of continuation. He'd spent 9 months treating it that way, treating the weight of Cooper and Reese as a symptom of damage, as evidence that the man who'd held a position alone for 6 hours had been replaced by something less intact. But weight wasn't damage. Weight was the accurate relationship with what had actually happened. Things that mattered were supposed to weigh something. The carrying wasn't broken. The carrying was correct. "Let's go," Thomas said. They walked to the car. The Pentagon. The following morning, 1000 hours. The room was smaller than Thomas had expected and was exactly right in being smaller. Not the vast ceremonial hall of military imagination, the version of this that existed in recruitment material and public-facing documentation. A conference room, essentially. Chairs arranged in the formal symmetry of events that were official without needing to be theatrical. The ceiling was not high. The lighting was fluorescent and even, and did not create the atmosphere of significance. The significance came from the people in the room, which was where it always came from, approximately 40 people. Every one of them with a specific and functional reason to be present. No spectators, no press. No apparatus of performance assembled around what was happening. Thomas stood at the front in his dress uniform. He had laid it out on the hotel bed the night before and looked at it for a long moment before touching it. The uniform of a person he had been for 22 years. The ribbons in their ordered rows, each one the compressed notation of a specific thing that had happened in a specific place at a specific cost. The rank on the collar, the trident on the chest that had been earned in water and sand and cold and exhaustion, and had never become ordinary, not because he kept reminding himself of its significance, but because the thing it represented was not ordinary, and a person who understood what it represented could not treat it as ordinary without being dishonest about what it meant. He had put the uniform on. His hands had been steady throughout. The left leg moved with its accommodation when he'd been standing for too long, but he had been standing into the Bello family, and the accommodation since 0730, and the accommodation was present and visible, and he had not done anything to minimize its visibility, because it was part of the record, and the record was what the ceremony existed to make official. Patricia Hess stood before him, exactly as her voice had suggested she would be, contained, precise, carrying her authority the way it was carried, when it had been internalized so completely that expressing it required no performance. It simply existed in the posture and the economy of movement and the way she occupied space, without requiring the space to validate her. Silver hair, close-cropped, dress uniform with the 2 stars of a rear admiral on the shoulders. She wore it the same way Thomas wore his, as skin rather than as costume, as the accurate external expression of something internal and permanent. She held the Navy Cross in both hands. She looked at Thomas for a moment before she spoke, and what the look contained was the specific regard of someone who had held a set of facts about a person and for 9 months, and was now in the physical presence of the person and finding the facts and the man to be consistent with each other. She placed the medal on his chest. Her hands were practiced and steady, and the placement was exact. Then she stepped back and looked at him. On behalf of a grateful nation, she said, her voice the same measured instrument it had been on the phone, carrying precisely what it needed to carry and nothing additional. And, on behalf of the 43 people who are alive today, because you stayed, thank you, Commander, the room applauded. Not the spontaneous, emotional response that a commercial aircraft cabin produced, the deliberate deliberate and measured acknowledgement of people who understood exactly what they were applauding and for whom the gesture was specific rather than general. It had the texture of people who had been inside the same events, at different angles, and were now in the same room. acknowledging that the events had been real and had mattered and had cost what they cost. Thomas looked across the room. Roy Tanner sat in the second row. The plain black cap was in his hands rather than on his head, held at his sternum in the formal position that military ceremonies produced it in people who had attended enough of them, that the posture was automatic. When Thomas's eyes found him, Roy nodded once. The nod from the aircraft, the nod of someone who had arrived somewhere they'd been traveling toward for a long time and was acknowledging the arrival. Stephanie Calloway sat 3 chairs from Roy. She had the letter out still in the envelope, still folded, held in her lap, with both hands, in the way Thomas had come to recognize. She was not watching the ceremony as it unfolded. She was looking at the middle distance, with the quality of someone doing something interior, something that involved her father and this room and the name on a wall at a clinic in Bethesda and the specific continuity between a man who had run toward noise for a living and the daughter who was about to become the kind of doctor who did the same. William Slade occupied a chair in the back row. He did not have his laptop. He had a small paper notepad on his knee, and at the top of it, in his precise analytical handwriting, were 2 names. Thomas was far enough away that he could not read them, but he did not need to read them. He knew what they were. Marcus Webb stood along the wall. In dress blues, he'd arrived late enough that the chairs had been filled and had taken the standing position without apparent concern, which was consistent with everything Thomas knew about Webb, which was that Webb operated in whatever conditions presented themselves and did not require conditions to be adjusted to his preferences. He and Thomas had not spoken directly yet, not in person. Their entire relationship had been conducted at 600 feet and over UHF radio frequency, and the in-person version was still pending. Webb looked at Thomas now with the expression of someone who had a significant thing to say and had identified the ceremony as not the correct moment and was holding it in reserve for the correct moment. Karen Brannigan stood beside Webb. She was not in dress blues. She'd flown the Escort the evening before and driven to Washington this morning in civilian clothes, gray jacket and dark pants. And she looked like a woman who had gotten approximately 4 hours of sleep and had decided that was adequate. She looked at Thomas with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who had made a decision on a flight line in Tucson without being asked and was entirely at peace with the decision. No performance, no expectation of reciprocity, just presence, which was the form that certain kinds of respect took when they had matured past the need for expression. The seat at the end of the front row was empty. On the seat was a piece of paper, folded once with Thomas's name on the outside, in handwriting he recognized on contact left-handed, compressed, the letters with the slight angularity of someone who had written quickly in cockpits and on knee cockpits and on kneeboard pads for 30 years, and whose handwriting had been permanently shaped by the constraints of those environments. Ed Merritt, who had a morning departure out of Reagan National and was not in this room, who had been here before the room filled. Thomas would read it later. He had a working hypothesis about its contents. He would read it anyway, with the attention it deserved, because things written by people who said important things in compressed form deserved to be read with attention proportional to what they contained. Hess stepped back. The formal portion of the ceremony concluded in the manner of people who respected everyone's time cleanly, without extended commentary, the record made and the official portion complete. Thomas stood at the front of the room, and people came to him individually and in pairs, with the consideration of people who understood that what they were applying was a person and not a receiving line. He shook hands. He listened. He said the things that were true and did not say the things that were classified. He received gratitude from people who meant it, and he received it with the same careful attention he'd given to Roy Tanner on the aircraft, letting it arrive where it was directed, without deflecting it, and without minimizing it, because deflecting it and minimizing it were forms of telling the people offering it that what they felt was incorrect, and what they felt was not incorrect. There was a difference between accepting gratitude and needing it. He had never needed it. He had not accepted it well either, for a long time, treating acceptance as a form of agreement with an assessment of himself that he didn't share. But gratitude from the people in this room was not about his assessment of himself. It was about their experience of what had happened in January. It was theirs. The correct relationship with it was to let it be theirs and to let them give it. He let them give it. Webb found him near the end, when the room had thinned to the last few conversations and the Pentagon staff were beginning the quiet administrative work of returning a conference room to its ordinary function. He came across the room with the direct movement that Thomas had come to associate with Webb as a person not aggressive, not performative, just the movement of someone who knew where they were going and went there. He was a few inches taller than Thomas had visualized from the encounter at 600 feet, which was the kind of thing you couldn't fully correct for even with a lot of tactical experience. They stood facing each other. Ghost, Webb said. Torch, Thomas said. A pause. The particular pause of two people who have a lot of history between them that was conducted through intermediaries' radio frequencies, mutual friends, the aircraft that had held position off the port wing, and are now in the direct version for the first time and are calibrating. I owe you an apology, Webb said, for the PA announcement. You didn't ask for it, and I didn't ask your permission in any meaningful way. I asked you not to stop me, and that's not the same thing. Thomas looked at him. It wasn't wrong, no, but it was without full consent and you deserved the choice. Webb held his gaze steadily. I've thought about it since. I would make the same decision. I still think you deserved the choice. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then, Brannigan is alive and has 2 kids in Tucson because the math said go back in. I went back in. That's the complete story. That's not the complete story, Webb said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been thinking about this for 12 years, and had arrived at a position that was not going to move, a fetch. The complete story includes a man who evaluated the math correctly, and then did the thing the math required in conditions that would have given most people sufficient justification to do the other thing. That part matters. Thomas was quiet. He did not agree with this assessment in the way Webb meant it, because he never had, and probably wouldn't. But he recognized that Webb was not wrong from where Webb stood, and that where Webb stood was legitimate. How is Brannigan? Thomas said. Good. He tried to get here today. Had an exercise that couldn't move. Webb paused. He wanted me to tell you specifically that his daughter's name is Claire. 5 years old. She has his wife's coloring and his stubbornness. He said you'd understand why he wanted you to know. Thomas looked at that, at the specific information of it, not the general fact of Brannigan's family, but the daughter's name, 5 years old. The level of specificity that said, this is the concrete form of what you made possible. This is what the math produced. Tell him Claire's a good name, Thomas said. Webb almost smiled. I'll tell him you said so. Karen Brannigan crossed the room and joined them. Up close, she had the look of someone who had been flying since before dawn, and who wore that fact without apology. The slight compression around the eyes, the particular stillness of a body that was managing fatigue through competence rather than rest. She looked at Thomas with the same direct quality she'd had from across the room, except now, at conversational distance, the quality was clearer, and Thomas could see that it was not the admiration of someone looking at an abstraction. It was the regard of one professional for another professional who had done something she understood the cost of. Commander Holt, she said. Major Brannigan, I've been wanting to say something to you for 12 years, she said. I've gone through about 30 versions of it. I've decided the most honest version is the shortest version. She held his gaze. Thank you for going back in. Thomas looked at her. How'd he get out of the wreckage on his own before I reached him? I've always wanted to know that. Something moved in Karen Brannigan's face, surprise, and then something warmer than surprise. He says he doesn't remember. I think he remembers, and he's protecting the version of the story where he's slightly more capable than the evidence suggests. That tracks, Thomas said. It absolutely tracks, she said. They stood in the thinning room for a few more minutes. The three of them, talking about Tucson and the F-16 program and the specific geometry of the missing man formation as executed over the Virginia border in late afternoon light. And Thomas let it be the conversation. It was not weighted, not significant in the way the day had been significant. Just three people in a room after a ceremony talking about their work, which was its own kind of right thing. 6 months later, the classroom at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado had 30 chairs arranged in 3 rows, and in those chairs sat 30 men who had survived Hell Week 21 days prior and were still wearing the evidence of it in the particular quality of their stillness. Not the stillness of ease, not the stillness of the Bello family, not the stillness of people who were comfortable. The stillness of people who had learned something precise about the relationship between what they were capable of and what they had previously believed they were capable of, and who were still integrating the distance between those two things. Thomas stood at the front, khaki instructor's uniform, the trident on his chest, the left leg doing what the left leg did after he'd been standing for 45 minutes, the slight accommodation that the Syria injury had written into him, and that he had stopped to make invisible because it was not invisible, and the attempt to make it invisible was a form of misrepresentation about what the job had cost. He let it be visible. He looked at 30 faces. They looked back with the complete attention of people who understood that they were in a room with someone who knew things they needed to know, and who were not going to miss a word. "My name is Commander Thomas Holt," he said. "My call sign is Ghost. Some of you know that name, some of you don't. Both are correct responses to a call sign that was specifically designed to be unknown." A pause. "Buds trained you. It trained you for what training can train: the physical threshold, the mental framework, the team architecture. What it cannot train is what happens in the years after. The accumulation, the names you'll add to the list you carry, the decisions you'll make in compressed time, in places where nothing about the playbook applies to the exact geometry of what's in front of you." He let the silence hold for a moment. "That's what I'm here to teach. Not because the things in the playbook are wrong. Because some things can only be learned after you've been in rooms where they were necessary." He looked at the 30 faces and saw what he always saw in rooms like this: youth, and the specific kind of attention that youth with something at stake produced. And underneath both of those things, the beginning of understanding that the cost of what they were entering was real and was going to be paid in currencies they hadn't fully identified yet. "I want to tell you about a man I met on an airplane," Thomas said, 6 months ago. His name was Roy Tanner. He was 63 years old. He had Parkinson's early stage. His right hand tremored. He had been carrying a photograph in his chest pocket for 18 years. He stopped, let the number settle in the room. His son was Army infantry. His son made it out of one of the worst nights of a particular operation in Iraq because someone held a position long enough for his unit to pull back. His son came home from that. He came home again 6 months later from a different operation in a box. Thomas looked at the rows. Roy Tanner had been carrying the story of the man who held that position for 18 years. He'd been carrying it in the specific way you carry something when you don't know where to put it down. Not as grief exactly, not as gratitude exactly. As an accounting that was still open, a debt whose recipient he hadn't been able to locate. The classroom was completely silent. He found me on the airplane. He told me the story, and I couldn't confirm it because the operation was classified, and the people in it were protected by that classification. And even 6 months into retirement, some habits are structural. I sat there and I listened, and I couldn't give him what he needed, which was the confirmation that the accounting was closed, that the debt had a face. Thomas paused. "But here's what I want you to understand about Roy Tanner. He didn't need the confirmation. He'd been carrying that accounting for 18 years, and he'd built a life around carrying it, not a broken life, a full life, with his family and his community and his VFW chapter, and a grief group he hated, and which helped him more than he'll admit. He'd built a life, and he'd carried the accounting, and he'd gotten on an airplane to Washington, and he'd walked 11 rows, Up an aisle, and he told the story to a man he thought might be the man it was about, because that was what carrying something correctly eventually required. The attempt at completion, even when completion wasn't guaranteed, he let that sit. You're going to lose people, as Thomas said. That is not a possibility that the profession offers you the choice of opting out of. You are going to be in rooms where the decisions are correct and the outcomes are still not what you needed them to be. You are going to write names in a list that you will carry for the rest of your life. And the question is not whether you carry those names you will, but whether you carry them correctly. A hand went up in the second row. Young. 24, maybe 25, with the eyes of someone who had been holding a specific question long enough that asking it felt like a risk worth taking. Sir, how do you carry them correctly? Thomas looked at the question. Let it be a real question rather than treating it as the rhetorical setup for a pre-assembled answer. You carry them as the standard, he said finally. Not as guilt. Guilt is about what you did wrong, the people you lose in correct operations, who go in doing the right thing and don't come back out. They're not in the guilt column, they're in the standard column. Every decision you make going forward, you ask, does this honor what they gave? Does this reflect the level they operated at? Are the men I'm leading being led the way they led? He stopped. It sounds simple. It isn't. It requires you to know specifically who you're carrying, their actual character, their actual decisions, the particular way they did the work. You have to know them well enough that the standard they represent is specific and not generic. Generic standards drift, specific ones hold. The room held the silence that classrooms held when something landed. I carried 2 men out of Syria, Thomas said. Cooper and Reese. I carry them specific. I know how Cooper allocated threat vectors, the particular sequence he ran through, the things he weighted first. I know how Reese communicated under pressure, the economy of it, the way he could say exactly what was needed in the minimum number of words. I carry those specifics as my standard, not as loss. As calibration. He looked across the 30 faces. That's the difference between carrying something correctly and carrying it in a way that breaks you. The breaking version treats them as absence. The correct version treats them as presence. They're still in the unit. They just changed roles, a second hand, different row. Someone who had been listening with a particular intensity and had arrived at a question that the first question had opened a path toward. Sir, what if the standard they represent is higher than what you think you can meet? Thomas looked at this candidate for a moment. At the specific honesty of the question, the willingness to admit, in a room full of people who had just survived Hell Week and were therefore not predisposed toward admissions of potential inadequacy, that the bar might be set above what he could reach. Then you try to reach it anyway, Thomas said, every day, knowing you won't always make it. The point is the direction, not the perfect execution. Cooper and Reese were not perfect operators. They were exceptional operators who were also human beings who made mistakes and recovered from them, and made different mistakes and recovered from those. The standard they represent is not perfection. It's the commitment to the direction. He paused. And when you fall short of the standard, which you will, on specific days, in specific moments, you don't revise the standard down to meet where you fell. You note where you fell, and you try again the next day. He looked at the rows. Welcome to the teams, he said. Let's get to work. 3 months after the first class, Bethesda, Maryland. A Wednesday morning in the middle of July. The kind of morning that was already warm before 8 a.m. and would arrive at properly hot before 10. The kind of July morning that this part of the country produced in the specific way that this part of the country produced things with a humidity that made the warmth sit differently than it sat in other places, heavier, more physical, as though the air itself was participating in the day, in a way that dry climate air didn't. Thomas pulled into the visitor parking lot of Naval Base Bethesda at 9:47 a.m. and cut the engine and sat for a moment in the car. The clinic was visible from where he'd parked. Callaway Clinic, the sign above the entrance in standard institutional lettering, clean and permanent, and the kind of thing that said this name was going to be here. for a long time, that the name had been placed with the intention that it would outlast the people who'd placed it. Through the glass front doors, he could see the lobby. He could see, at the left side of the lobby, a wall, dark granite, polished. He couldn't read it from the parking lot, but he knew what it said because he had read the dedication program that Stephanie had forwarded to him 3 weeks after the ceremony, and had memorized the text, the way he memorized operational details without trying to, through the repetition of attention. HM2 Patrick Calloway, Kandahar, Afghanistan, 2012. He had driven himself here from the hotel where he'd stayed for the 2-day Pentagon consultation that had ended yesterday afternoon. He had planned this stop before he'd planned anything else about the trip, had put the Bethesda address in his phone, before he'd booked this hotel, before he'd looked at flight times, because he had told Stephanie Calloway on an aircraft over Arizona that he would come. And that had not been reassurance. That had been a statement of fact about what he was going to do. A car pulled into the lot. He recognized it not as the specific vehicle. He'd never seen Stephanie Calloway's car, but as the vehicle a person like Stephanie drove, which was to say practical and slightly older, and not particularly clean because she was a medical student Funnit in the final stretch of her program, and cleaning her car ranked appropriately low in her hierarchy of things requiring attention. She got out. Grey jacket over scrubs. She'd come from somewhere clinical or was going somewhere clinical or both. Medical backpack over one shoulder, the same backpack from the aircraft, moving with the efficiency of someone who had a significant number of things happening in their life and had made specific time for this one. She saw him as she cleared the car door. Stopped. The expression on her face was the expression of someone for whom a hoped-for thing has become an actual thing. Surprise. Inside expectation, the particular version of arrival that contained the acknowledgement that you'd hoped but hadn't been certain. And now you were certain, and the certainty was its own kind of thing to absorb. She crossed the lot. "You came," she said. "I said I would, I know." She looked at him for a moment with the direct, clear attention that had been consistent in her since the aircraft, the quality of someone who had learned to say what she meant and to hear what was said without layering it. "I know you did." She stopped, restarted. "I'm glad you're here." A car door opened in the lot behind her. Thomas looked past her. Roy Tanner had gotten out of a sedan. He'd driven himself the slight hurry in his movements as he closed the door. Suggested the drive had taken longer than planned, which was consistent with DC area traffic on a Wednesday morning at 9:47. He was wearing the dark blue polo with the faded shoulders and the plain black cap, and he was carrying something in both hands, held carefully at chest height, the way you carried something you intended to deliver without damaging, a framed photograph. Tommy Tanner, army dress uniform, the same image that had lived in a chest pocket for 18 years, but now enlarged and properly framed and preserved behind glass. The kind of preservation that said, "This is no longer being kept close because I'm afraid of losing it. This is being placed because I trust the place." He crossed the lot and joined them at the entrance. "I called the clinic director," Roy said, without preamble, looking at the building rather than at either of them. 6 weeks ago. Asked if they had a display area for photographs of service members who'd served alongside Navy medical personnel. She said they had an empty case in the lobby that they'd been intending to fill. Thomas looked at the framed photograph. Tommy, 23, in dress uniform, not quite smiling but close. The grin was visible in the almost smile even in this more formal photograph. It was structural. It had been part of his face rather than something he put on it. He'd have wanted to be here, Roy said. He was that kind of person. The ceremonies, the acknowledgements, he didn't need them for himself, but he understood why they mattered. He would have wanted to stand in this lobby next to you. He looked at Thomas. "West, I'm here instead." "It's not the same thing." "It's not," Thomas said. "It's also not nothing." Roy looked at him. Something moved in his expression, the movement of a person who has heard something that is accurate in a way that required precision to be accurate, and who recognizes the precision. He nodded once. The three of them went inside. The lobby was clean and bright and functional in the way of a medical facility, built to serve people, not to impress, not to comfort in the aesthetic sense, but to work, to be the physical context for the work that happened inside it. The air smelled of antiseptic and the specific institutional cleanliness of a place that was kept clean because cleanliness was operationally necessary rather than decorative. Staff moved through with the purposeful flow of people who had things to do and were doing them. The wall was to the left. They walked to it and stopped. Thomas looked at the name. He did not say anything. He stood there and read it and let it be what it was, a name on a wall, in a building named for the man the name belonged to, in an institution that existed to do the thing the man had devoted his life to doing. The record, the permanent notation, HM2 Patrick Calloway, who had run toward noise for a living and who had written his daughter a letter about what the running meant, and who was not here to see the building that carried his name, or the daughter who was about to become the kind of doctor he'd described in the letter. Stephanie stood to Thomas's left. She was not looking at the wall. She was looking at something in the middle distance that only she could see, and her hands were at her sides, and the letter was in her jacket pocket where it always was, but she was not holding it. She didn't need to hold it today. Today she was standing in front of her father's name, in her father's building, in her scrubs with her medical backpack and her graduation 3 weeks away, and she didn't need to hold the letter because she was already living in the direction it had pointed her. The clinic director came from a corridor to meet them, a woman in her 50s in a white coat, with the manner of someone who had heard the shape of this story and had been waiting for it to arrive in her lobby in person. She shook hands with each of them, and she looked at Roy's photograph and said she had exactly the right place for it. She said she was honored they'd come. She was saying this to Roy, but also to all three of them, and they all understood it was addressed to all three. Roy handed the photograph over with the careful deliberateness of someone handing something important to someone they trusted with it. He watched the director carry it toward the display case at the right side of the entrance. He watched it travel across the lobby and stop at the case and be placed inside. He watched the case close. He put his hands in his pockets. Looked at the wall with Patrick Calloway's name. Looked at Thomas, lighter, he said. The same word as on the aircraft 6 months ago, when Thomas had first used it, and Roy had heard it, and it had been the right word. Now Roy was saying it as a report on his own current state. As an update. Still there, Thomas said. Still there, Roy agreed. But lighter? That's it, Thomas said. That's exactly it. Stephanie looked at her father's name, and then at the photograph now visible in the display case across the lobby. Tommy Tanner, army dress uniform, almost smiling, and then at Roy Tanner standing with his hands in his pockets and the plain black cap on his head, and the particular stillness of a man who had put something down in the correct place. My father would have known your son's unit, she said to Roy. Korsman knew the infantry units they worked adjacent to. He would have known the name. She paused. He would have remembered it. Roy looked at her. I believe that, he said, not politely. As a considered assessment, they're adjacent now, Stephanie said. She gestured at the wall and the display case, Patrick Calloway's name on the granite, and Tommy Tanner's photograph in the case 10 feet away. They're in the same lobby. That's something. It's quite a lot, Roy said. They stood there, Thomas and Roy Tanner and Stephanie Calloway, in the lobby of a building named for a man who had run toward noise, with a photograph of a young man who had gotten 6 more months, and a wall that said a name that would be there, long after all three of them were gone, and the July heat pressing against the glass front doors of the clinic, that was already full of people doing the work that the name on the wall had given his life to do. Thomas looked at all of it, let it be what it was without trying to resolve it into meaning. The weight was still there. It would always be there. Cooper and Reese were still in his chest at their specific addresses, still pressing outward with their specific gravity. Tommy Tanner was still in Roy's pocket, even though the framed version was now in a display case across the lobby. Patrick Calloway was still in an envelope in Stephanie's jacket, in the handwriting that had been placed there for a graduation that was 3 weeks away. None of that was going away, but weight was not damage. Weight was the honest relationship with what had actually happened and at what it had cost, and who had paid it. The people who carried weight correctly were not the people who had found a way to make it lighter. They were the people who had learned to carry it while also moving, while also working, while also standing in lobbies and teaching classrooms, and walking across airport parking lots, and getting on planes to places they needed to be. The moving and the carrying were not in competition. They were the same act. You moved because you carried them. You carried them in the direction of the moving. He had been ghost for 22 years, invisible by design, forgotten by intention, moving through rooms in a way that left no mark. He understood now, standing in a lobby in Bethesda on a Wednesday morning in July, that invisibility and isolation were not the same thing, and that he had been confusing them for 9 months, and that the confusion had been the most expensive mistake of the period since Syria. He was not invisible here. He was standing in a lobby with Roy Tanner and Stephanie Calloway, and the name of a man he'd never met and the photograph of a young man he'd never met and the weight of 2 men he'd known better than he'd known almost anyone. He was entirely visible to all of it. He was letting it see him. That was enough. That was, in the precise accounting, everything. If you've ever known someone who served quietly and asked for nothing in return, drop their branch in the comments. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Coast Guard. Let's make sure they're not invisible here.